Imagine a place that was supposed to be holy, a place where women were sent to devote their lives to God, far away from the temptations of the outside world. To the medieval mind, convents were sacred, pure, untouchable. But behind those thick stone walls, reality was far darker. For centuries, stories circulated about what truly happened in the cloisters of medieval Europe. Some tales spoke of hidden lovers, forbidden children, and whispered sins. Others told of demonic possessions, mass hysteria, and women driven to madness by the crushing isolation of convent life. These were not the tales told in church sermons. These were the buried scandal secrets the church tried to silence, but which still leak out through trial records, inquisitions, and confessions. And once we dig into them, we find a shocking truth. Convents were not always the safe havens they were supposed to be. Instead, they were often prisons, laboratories of human desire, and sometimes arenas of horror. In this video, we are going to peel back the curtain and reveal the horrific, intimate secrets of medieval nuns, a hidden world of forbidden love, coercion, secret pregnancies, witchcraft accusations, and even murder. But before we dive deeper, if you love exploring the darkest corners of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Past of Medieval, and give this video a like. It helps us bring you even more of these strange and forgotten stories from the past. Now, let's begin our descent into the shadows of the cloister. First, we need to understand why so many women ended up in convents in the first place. Today, when we think of nuns, we often imagine women freely choosing a life of devotion. But in the Middle Ages, the story was very different. For many families, sending a daughter to the convent wasn't about holiness. It was about money, politics, or convenience. Poor families who couldn't afford a dowry used the convent as a way to dispose of daughters. Wealthy families sometimes locked away rebellious girls, widows, or inconvenient heirs. And in some chilling cases, very young children were given to the church before they even understood what vows of chastity and obedience meant. So imagine yourself in the shoes of one of these women. You're barely a teenager. You didn't choose this life. You are told you must abandon the outside world forever. Your hair is cut off. You're dressed in black. You are sealed inside a convent with rules that demand silence, obedience, and purity for the rest of your life. For some, this was a life of peace and stability. But for others, it was a life sentence. And when human desires collided with strict religious control, things turned dark. When people picture a medieval convent, they often imagine an isolated, holy place filled with women who had renounced the world and all its temptations. These women were supposed to live as brides of Christ, their bodies and minds devoted only to prayer and service. But the truth behind the stone walls was far darker, far more human, and in many cases, far more scandalous than the church would ever dare admit. At the very center of this contradiction stood the relationship between priests and nuns. The convent may have been a place of enclosure, but it was never cut off from the male clergy. Priests were allowed entry to hear confessions, celebrate mass, and provide spiritual guidance. To the church, this was necessary. To human nature, it was dangerous. Confession, especially, was a fragile boundary line. Imagine a young nun, perhaps forced into the convent by her family, kneeling in the dim light before a priest. She whispers her most private thoughts, her doubts, her weaknesses, her forbidden desires. And on the other side, the priest holds the power to forgive or condemn. That moment, charged with secrecy and vulnerability, could easily turn into something else. Some priests took advantage, using their authority to manipulate and seduce. Others formed real attachments, swept up in emotions they themselves were forbidden to express. Records of church investigations show that such encounters were far from rare. In one infamous case from 14th century France, an inquiry revealed that nearly every nun in a particular convent was pregnant at the same time. The scandal spread quickly and the church rushed to cover it up. The official story was that the devil had deceived them. But the truth, uncovered in testimonies, was much simpler. The priests who came to hear confessions had instead been fathering children in secret. Of course, these pregnancies posed a terrifying problem. A convent was no place for infants. Their very existence exposed the forbidden relationships and shattered the illusion of purity that the church worked so hard to maintain. So, what happened to the babies? Historical evidence suggests three grim outcomes. Some newborns were abandoned at church doors or orphanages, left to strangers in the hope of avoiding scandal. Others were smuggled away to distant villages, never to know their true parentage. And in the most chilling cases, infants were buried in secret graves within convent grounds. Archaeologists in Spain, Italy, and France have unearthed small burial sites that seem to confirm this. Hidden beneath cloister floors and garden soil, the tiny skeletons of infants tell a silent story of desperation and cover-up. And yet, the women were almost always the ones punished. A priest might be quietly reassigned or, a worse, defrocked, but nuns caught in such affairs were treated as the very embodiment of sin. Some were expelled, their reputations forever ruined. Others were condemned to lifelong penance, locked into silence, beaten, or forced to fast as a reminder of their disobedience. In the eyes of the church, a woman who broke her vows was not a victim, she was the proof of corruption. Still, not every relationship was born from manipulation. Buried in dusty archives are letters that tell a different story of passion, longing, and even love. In one collection of 5th-10th century writings, a nun secretly described her priest lover as her eternal soul's companion. She begged him to meet her in hidden corridors, to share stolen moments of intimacy in a world where discovery meant ruin. Such letters remind us that beneath the layers of scandal and shame were real human emotions, love, lust, and loneliness, all colliding inside walls that were supposed to crush them. And what about the ordinary people who lived near these convents? For them, such revelations were shocking, even terrifying. Nuns were supposed to be living symbols of purity. If they could fall into sin so openly, what did that say about the holiness of the church itself? Every scandal chipped away at the sacred image the clergy worked so hard to project. Some villagers whispered that these affairs were not human weakness at all, but the work of the devil. That demons had slipped into convents, tempting holy women and corrupting priests. It's easy to dismiss such talk as superstition, but the more you look at the records, the more you see how fear and rumor shaped reality. Whenever groups of nuns acted strangely, convulsing, screaming, or behaving in bizarre ways, people were quick to claim that they were possessed. Entire convents became infamous for outbreaks of demonic hysteria. Were these episodes really the devil's work? Or were they the psychological toll of isolation, repression, and hidden guilt? Whatever the cause, such events spread fear like wildfire. Suddenly, the convent was not just a place of whispered sins and secret affairs. It was a place haunted by demons, by madness, and by the weight of human desires that no vow could truly suppress. The Middle Ages were an age obsessed with sin and salvation, but also with the devil's supposed power to corrupt the innocent. And nowhere did this fear burn brighter than in the cloisters of Europe's convents. Behind walls built for prayer and silence, women were suddenly shrieking, convulsing, and speaking in tongues. The church called it possession. Historians now call it hysteria, but to those who lived through it, it was something far more terrifying. One of the most infamous outbreaks happened in Loudun, France in the 17th century. Though technically outside the medieval era, it reveals just how long these patterns endured. A group of Ursuline nuns claimed they were tormented by invisible demons. They screamed obscenities, writhed on the floor, and accused priests of seducing them through witchcraft. Crowds gathered outside the convent to watch these dramatic displays, convinced they were witnessing a battle between God and the devil. The church, eager to find a scapegoat, put Father Urbain Grandier on trial for sorcery. He was burned alive in 1634 officially as a witch, but in reality, as a man caught in a storm of repression, rumor, and politics. But Loudun was not unique. Similar outbreaks appeared across Europe, and medieval convents were especially prone to them. In Germany, records tell of nuns who began to meow like cats for hours on end. In Spain, entire convents were struck with fits of uncontrollable laughter, then violent rage. In Italy, nuns stripped off their habits and ran naked through cloisters, claiming invisible forces compelled them. The church documented these events with alarm, often blaming witches or Satan himself. Modern historians see something else at work: the crushing isolation of convent life. Imagine young women, some as young as 12, torn from their families and forced into silence and obedience. Add to that the constant warnings of eternal damnation, the fear of hellfire, the suppression of every natural desire. It's not hard to see why these pressures sometimes erupted in collective breakdowns. Today, we might call it mass psychosis. But in a world steeped in superstition, the only explanation was possession. And so the cycle fed itself. The more the nuns acted out, the more priests and inquisitors came to exorcise them. But exorcisms were not gentle prayers whispered over trembling women. They were violent confrontations, complete with holy water, shouting, restraints, and sometimes beatings. The belief was simple. The devil had to be forced out, no matter the cost. To those inside the convent, these rituals only deepened the hysteria. The nuns screamed louder, shook harder, and the crowds outside grew larger. At the heart of these possessions was always the same forbidden subject, sex. The demons the nuns described were often male, seductive, and overpowering. They whispered that they had been touched, ravished, and violated by invisible spirits in the night. To the clergy, this was proof that lust was the devil's weapon. To us, it's a chilling reflection of repressed desire and trauma taking on supernatural form. One case from a convent in Spain tells of a nun who claimed nightly visits from a demon lover. She described him in detail, his caresses, his whispered words, the way he forced her to surrender. Instead of compassion, she was interrogated, accused of inviting the demon through her own sin. She was beaten, locked in solitary confinement, and forced to fast until she nearly died. In the church's eyes, she had not been attacked. She had been complicit. But the most frightening consequence of these outbreaks was not the torment of the women, it was the executions that followed. In many cases, the hysteria inside convents spilled outward, leading to accusations of witchcraft against innocent villagers. If the nuns claimed they saw witches flying over the walls at night, or felt cursed by a neighbor's glance, the accused rarely stood a chance. Dozens were burned because cloistered women, driven by repression and fear, believed their own visions. And yet, beneath all this terror, there's a haunting irony. These women were supposed to be the purest of all Christians. Yet, when the pressures of silence, chastity, and obedience became unbearable, their bodies and minds rebelled in ways the church could not control. Their screams, their fits, their so-called possessions, these were cries for freedom, twisted into spectacles of horror. In a way, the convent became a mirror for society's deepest fears. On the outside, it represented holiness, purity, and divine order. On the inside, it revealed how fragile those ideals truly were. Every outbreak of hysteria was a crack in the facade, a reminder that beneath the prayers and vows, these were human beings, not saints carved in stone. And as the Middle Ages wore on, the scandals only grew darker. From whispered affairs to demonic possessions, the church's supposed sanctuaries were anything but safe. But what happened when those in power, the abbesses, the bishops, even popes themselves, decided to exploit this system of secrecy for their own twisted desires? If you think convents were only prisons of silence and hysteria, you'd only be half right. They were also places where power itself was abused, where those who were supposed to protect the women inside often became their worst tormentors. Let's begin with the abbess. In theory, an abbess was a spiritual mother, a woman chosen to guide her sisters in prayer and discipline. But in reality, an abbess often wielded enormous authority. She controlled the convent's wealth, decided punishments, and determined how strictly rules would be enforced. In many cases, she acted less like a mother and more like a tyrant. There are chilling reports of abbesses punishing young novices with days of isolation, beatings and starvation simply for breaking silence or showing reluctance to take vows. One account from Germany describes an abbess who forced rebellious girls to kneel naked in the freezing chapel for hours, claiming it would burn the devil's lust from their bodies. To the outside world, these punishments were cloaked in the language of discipline. Inside the walls, they were instruments of cruelty, but the exploitation did not stop at abbesses. Bishops, too, had power over convents, and history is full of stories of them abusing it. In Italy, bishops were supposed to inspect convents to ensure rules were being followed. In practice, many used these visits as opportunities to prey on vulnerable women. Records survive of bishops accused of coercing nuns into sexual favors under the guise of spiritual direction. One chilling phrase appears again and again in court cases of the time: seduced under obedience. In other words, the women were forced to submit because refusing meant punishment or even damnation. And then there were the popes. Yes, even the men who claimed to be the holiest on earth could not resist the hidden world of the convent. Take Pope Alexander VI, the infamous Borgia Pope of the late 15th century. His reign was notorious for excess and scandal, and rumors swirled that convents in Rome were not places of prayer, but extensions of his pleasure palace. Some sources claim that young women were sent there not to serve God, but to serve the desires of the powerful. Another shocking example comes from the convent of Sant'Ambrogio in Rome, centuries later. It was a place where mysticism and corruption blended in horrifying ways. Nuns were told they would achieve divine ecstasy through secret sexual rituals enforced by their superiors. When word of this reached the Vatican, an investigation uncovered not only abuse but poisonings and murder within the cloister. The scandal shook Rome to its core, proving just how dangerous unchecked power could become inside these walls. And yet, the Church often silenced such scandals. Convents were supposed to symbolize purity and holiness. To admit the truth that within them, women were abused, exploited, and even killed would shatter that image. So many stories never left the cloisters. The victims carried their secrets to the grave, their suffering erased by official silence. But fragments survive in court documents, whispered testimonies, and the accounts of those rare nuns who dared to rebel. One such voice was that of Marguerite Porete, a French mystic who challenged the Church's authority by writing about her visions of divine love. She was not in a convent, but her defiance reflected what many enclosed women must have felt: the desire for freedom, for a connection to God not controlled by men. For her courage, she was burned at the stake in 1310. This brings us to a haunting reality. Convents were never only prisons, they were battlegrounds. On one side, young women forced into vows they never chose. On the other, powerful figures, abbesses, bishops, and popes who used those vows as chains. Between them lay silence, fear, and the weight of obedience. And yet, despite the corruption, there were always whispers of resistance. Some nuns wrote secret letters describing their torment. Others attempted escape, though few succeeded. A handful even took lovers, desperate to claim their humanity in a world that denied it. Every one of these women risked punishment, scandal, or death. But their actions reveal something the Church could never fully suppress: the human spirit's refusal to be broken. The story of convents, then, is not only about repression. It is about power, the power to control, to exploit, and sometimes to resist. And while many women were victims, some managed to turn the very system against itself, carving out secret spaces of freedom inside walls meant to imprison them. But what happened when these secret rebellions went too far? When the line between mystical devotion and forbidden passion blurred completely, and convents themselves became theaters of scandal? That's where our story turns next. For all the silence, the prayers, and the rules, convents were never able to fully silence one thing: desire. Behind cloister walls where women were told to kill every earthly passion, those same passions often grew stronger, warped by repression into secret loves, dangerous liaisons, and scandals that sometimes rocked kingdoms. Let us start with one of the most infamous cases: the story of Héloïse and Abelard in 12th century France. Héloïse was a brilliant young woman forced into the convent after her love affair with the philosopher Peter Abelard ended in tragedy. Their letters, still preserved today, reveal a raw, human longing that refused to die even after vows of chastity were taken. Héloïse confessed that she prayed more to Abelard than to God, that her body remembered him in every moment of supposed devotion. She embodied a truth the Church tried desperately to hide: vows could not erase the human heart. But Héloïse was far from the only one. Throughout Europe, convents were caught in scandals involving not just priests and monks, but sometimes kings and noblemen who smuggled their lovers into the cloisters. In Spain, there are records of nuns climbing convent walls at night to meet lovers in nearby gardens. In Germany, a 14th century chronicle describes a convent where nearly every nun was discovered. To be secretly pregnant, a scandal so great the convent was shut down entirely. Even bishops, the very men tasked with protecting these women, were often their secret partners. Letters from the time complained bitterly about convents becoming brothels of priests, places where vows were broken not in whispers but in plain sight. Some abbesses themselves even encouraged these relationships, allowing their nuns to take powerful men as protectors in exchange for money or influence. What was cloaked as spiritual guidance was often nothing more than exploitation, but love wasn't always forced or transactional. Sometimes it was deeply personal, even revolutionary. In Florence, a nun named Sister Benedetta claimed to have visions of Christ, but when examined, it was discovered that she was in a passionate relationship with another nun. Their story, recorded in the records of the Inquisition, reveals not only how desire blossomed in the cloister, but how dangerous it was to admit it. For such relationships, women could be branded heretics, beaten, or even executed. And then there were the scandals that shook the highest levels of society. Take the case of King Philip II of Spain, whose spies uncovered rumors of noble daughters having affairs inside convents. Some of these women were caught smuggling letters and even disguised lovers into their cells. To preserve honor, these scandals were buried, but the whispers remained. It showed that even among the most pious, even in the holiest of places, desire could not be extinguished. Perhaps the most disturbing part of these stories is the way the Church responded. Instead of questioning why so many women resisted or broke their vows, the blame was always placed on the nuns themselves. A woman who longed for love was branded weak, sinful, or possessed by the devil. Rarely was the priest or bishop punished. Instead, the nun would be flogged, locked in isolation, or even executed for dishonoring her vow. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet, despite the risks, forbidden love persisted. Some women escaped convents entirely to be with their lovers. Others kept the secret until death, their lives a silent rebellion against a system that denied them choice. In their hidden letters, in their secret meetings, in the whispers carried through convent corridors, you can hear the heartbeat of resistance. These women refused to be reduced to silent brides of Christ. They lived, they loved, and they defied. The scandals, of course, fueled gossip across Europe. To outsiders, these stories became proof of corruption, whispered evidence that the Church was not as holy as it claimed. Reformers would later use these tales to argue against the institution of cloistered convents altogether. After all, if convents could not contain desire, if vows of chastity were constantly broken, then what was the point of forcing women into them? And yet, for all the disgrace, these forbidden loves also reveal something profound, the resilience of human passion. Stripped of freedom, forced into vows, and threatened with eternal damnation, these women still found ways to claim moments of intimacy. Their scandals were not just sins. They were acts of survival, sparks of humanity in a world that tried to extinguish them. But scandals did not always end with whispers and secret meetings. Sometimes they spiraled into violence, into poisonings, betrayals, and murder within the cloister walls. Because where passion is forbidden, it often becomes obsession. And obsession in the silent, locked world of the convent could turn deadly. When you think of a convent, you imagine quiet halls, the sound of hymns, and women devoted entirely to God. But history reveals that these sacred walls sometimes became crime scenes, filled with deadly rivalries, secret poisons, and whispered betrayals that ended in blood. Life in a convent was not always peaceful. Imagine dozens of women locked together for life, many against their will. They were told to bury their desires, to obey without question, and to live as brides of Christ. But behind the forced smiles and silent prayers, jealousy and resentment brewed. Rivalries over position, favoritism, or secret love affairs could ignite into rage. And since direct confrontation was dangerous, many turned to the silent weapon of choice, poison. One of the most notorious cases comes from Renaissance Italy, where convents were often tied to powerful families. A nun named Sister Virginia de Leyva, born into Milanese nobility, became infamous in the early 1600s when it was revealed that her convent had turned into a den of scandal. Virginia herself was discovered to have taken a lover, fathering a child in secret. When whispers threatened to expose her, stories suggest that poison was used within the convent to silence anyone who might betray her. Whether servant, rival, or even another nun, inconvenient voices could be easily erased. But this was not an isolated tale. In Germany, court records from the 15th century describe an abbess accused of murdering several of her own sisters through poisoned wine, supposedly to maintain her authority and cover up illicit affairs. While some dismissed it as slander from enemies of the convent, the repeated pattern of similar accusations across Europe shows that such things were not rare fantasy. And what made poison so appealing? In the cloister, it was almost perfect. Easy to slip into food or drink, it could kill slowly, leaving little evidence in an age before forensic science. A nun who fell sick could be dismissed as punished by God, struck down for some secret sin. In some cases, the death might even be hailed as divine judgment. No one outside the convent would question it. Though poison was only one form of violence. Betrayals and jealousies sometimes exploded into open brutality. Chronicles tell of fights between nuns that turned into deadly struggles. In 14th century Spain, one convent reportedly became so violent that the bishop had to intervene after sisters were caught attacking each other with knives during a dispute over stolen food. Even worse were the conspiracies that drew in outsiders. In Florence, investigators uncovered a plot where nuns had conspired with local men to murder an abbess who had grown too strict. The women, denied even the smallest freedoms, struck back in the only way they could imagine, with blood. The abbess survived the first attempt, but the scandal revealed a terrifying truth. That these holy houses could be just as dangerous as the corrupt courts of kings. But why did such darkness thrive here? The answer lies in repression. When you lock away young women, many of them forced into vows they never wanted, you create a pressure cooker. Add forbidden love, favoritism, or the abuse of power, and that pressure has to escape somewhere. Sometimes it escaped in affairs, other times in madness, and sometimes it exploded in murder. Of course, the church tried to keep these scandals hidden. When whispers of poison or murder reached the public, they were often buried beneath layers of official silence. Records were destroyed, trials suppressed, and punishments carried out in secret. But the stories that leaked, through letters, rumors, and rare court documents, paint a chilling picture of life in some cloisters. And what is most disturbing is how these violent acts were often blamed not on the conditions of convent life, but on the devil. If a nun poisoned another, it was said she had been possessed. If she killed in a fit of rage, it was because Satan had entered her heart. By blaming demons, the church could avoid addressing the deeper truth, that forcing women into vows, stripping them of freedom and denying them normal human lives created a world where sin and violence were almost inevitable. Still, despite the cover-ups, despite the fear, these stories remain. They show us that beneath the quiet image of the medieval convent, there was a darker reality, a place where human desires, resentments, and hatreds were not erased by religion, but intensified by it. And in the end, convents became more than just houses of prayer. They were theaters of secrecy, desire, and sometimes death. But as shocking as poison and murder were, they were not the only horrors hidden in cloister walls. Some scandals went even deeper, involving exorcisms, demonic possessions, and public spectacles where nuns themselves became accused of witchcraft. When whispers of scandal could no longer be explained by sin alone, medieval people often reached for another answer: possession. If a nun disobeyed, raged, or acted strangely, the explanation was not that she was frustrated, lonely, or repressed, but that the devil had taken her body. And so, throughout Europe, convents became stages for public battles between God and Satan. One of the most infamous cases took place in Loudun, France. In the 1630s, the nuns of the Ursuline convent began convulsing, screaming, and making obscene gestures during prayer. They accused a local priest, Urbain Grandier, of using sorcery to seduce and control them. Night after night, the convent echoed with their cries, their bodies twisting as though unseen hands gripped them. Crowds gathered outside to hear their wails. To the townsfolk, it seemed the devil himself had invaded the cloister. Grandier, already disliked by powerful rivals, was dragged to trial. The spectacle became one of the most notorious witchcraft cases in European history. He was tortured, condemned, and burned alive, while the nuns continued their dramatic fits for months. Some historians today suggest that the events may have been hysteria born of repression, or even manipulation by the church to eliminate a troublesome priest. But for contemporaries, the Loudon possessions confirmed their darkest fears, that the convent, meant to protect purity, could instead become a gateway for hell. And Loudon was far from unique. Reports of demonic possession in convents appeared across the continent. In Germany, a convent in Quedlinburg became infamous after several nuns claimed they were being tormented by spirits who whispered blasphemies in their ears. In Italy, convent records describe nuns suddenly screaming uncontrollably during Mass, or stripping off their clothes in front of horrified priests. Such behavior, shocking and forbidden, was immediately read as evidence of Satan's presence. But was it truly the devil? Or the unbearable weight of repression? Modern scholars have pointed out that many so-called possessions happened in environments where nuns were tightly controlled, silenced, and denied outlets for expression. A young woman having fits, speaking in strange voices, or acting wildly might have been suffering under stress, abuse, or even epilepsy. Yet, in an age obsessed with demons, these behaviors were interpreted as spiritual warfare. And once the church labeled it demonic, the response was brutal. Exorcisms were carried out in front of audiences. Priests commanded the devil to leave while the nun thrashed, screamed, and sometimes revealed intimate secrets under supposed demonic influence. Some were tied down, beaten, or forced to drink holy water until they vomited. Others were made to undergo repeated fasts and humiliations, supposedly to starve the devil out of their bodies. In some cases, the possessions were tied to accusations of witchcraft. If a nun claimed another sister had cursed her, suspicions spread like wildfire. Trials followed, and in rare but horrifying cases, nuns themselves were accused of being witches. Imagine that, women who had been forced into cloisters to prove their holiness, suddenly dragged out and paraded before inquisitors as servants of the devil. The spectacle of possession was not always suppressed. Sometimes, it was encouraged. A possessed convent drew attention. Pilgrims came, bishops visited, and the church could use the event to demonstrate its power over evil. It turned nuns into unwilling performers in a theater of faith, where their suffering was displayed as proof of the church's authority. But beneath the rituals and accusations, the human reality was far darker. Many of these women were victims of their confinement, of their superiors, and of a society that would rather believe in demons than confront the damage it was causing. By blaming the devil, the church avoided facing its own responsibility for the torment inside convent walls. And so, possession became another mask. Behind it, we glimpse the same truths we've seen in forbidden love affairs, secret births, and even murder. That the convent was not simply a house of God, but a crucible of human desire, repression, and suffering. Yet even possession and witchcraft were not the end of the story, because some scandals went beyond the private life of cloisters and burst into the public stage of politics, involving popes, kings, and scandals so massive that entire orders were changed forever. When we think of convents, we imagine silence, prayer, and seclusion. But history shows us that cloisters were never fully cut off from the outside world. Politics seeped through the barred windows just as temptation had. And when the ambitions of popes, kings, and noble families collided with the fragile lives of nuns, the result was not holiness, but scandal on a grand scale. One of the most infamous cases erupted in the 15th century, when Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Rodrigo Borgia, used convents as tools for political maneuvering. His papacy was already drenched in allegations of corruption, nepotism, and sexual debauchery. But few know that convents themselves played a role in his family's schemes. Wealthy families often donated their daughters to convents to secure papal favor or political alliances. These young women were not only cloistered for piety, but also used as bargaining chips. Their virginity, their vows, and even their scandals could be leveraged for influence. In one particularly lurid episode, whispers spread that Alexander's court had arranged for certain convents in Rome to act as hidden retreats for priests and cardinals seeking pleasure. Whether these stories were exaggerated by the Pope's enemies or rooted in truth, they reveal how deeply suspicion of corruption had entwined itself with the image of religious life. To the common people, convents had become symbols not of purity, but of hypocrisy. But Rome was not the only stage. In Spain and Portugal, the nobility often forced unwanted daughters into convents to keep inheritance lines clean. Yet these daughters were not silent. Some resisted, forming secret networks to write letters to powerful relatives, smuggle messages out, or even engage in scandalous affairs with visiting confessors. When these secrets spilled into public view, entire noble families found themselves disgraced. One striking example comes from the Convent of Santa Clara in Lisbon, where by the early 1500s, rumors swirled that nuns were holding clandestine feasts, drinking wine, and inviting men inside. When a royal investigation was launched, witnesses described a convent life that looked more like a court of entertainment than a cloister of prayer. Several noble families tried desperately to hush the scandal, but the damage was done. The convent became infamous, and the crown was forced to intervene. Elsewhere, convents could even become prisons for political rivals. In Italy, noble women accused of scandal, treachery, or simply falling out of favor were locked into convents as punishment. These women, some of them unwilling nuns, brought their bitterness with them. They stirred unrest, spread tales of abuse, and sometimes even orchestrated escapes. In one dramatic case in Ferrara, a group of cloistered women attempted to dig their way out through the convent walls. They were caught, publicly shamed, and punished. But their act of defiance only fueled gossip about what was truly happening inside. Not even queens were safe. In 16th century England, when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and convents, reports circulated, some true, many likely propaganda, that convents were dens of iniquity, where nuns bore illegitimate children and buried them in secret graves. Whether fabricated or not, these stories justified Henry's destruction of centuries of monastic tradition and helped cement the idea of convents as morally corrupted institutions. But perhaps the most disturbing intertwining of politics and convent life happened in Mexico in the 17th century, where colonial convents became places of both refuge and scandal. Many daughters of wealthy Spanish colonists were sent there, and behind the barred windows, wealth created a strange double life. Some convents were lavish, filled with silks, jewelry, and feasts, while others lived in stark poverty. The gap fueled resentment and rumors. One case, recorded by the Inquisition, involved a nun accused of using witchcraft to seduce a high-ranking colonial official. Her trial revealed layers of corruption, exploitation, and political maneuvering, all centered on the convent walls. Through these stories, we see a pattern. Convents were never just religious houses. They were political pawns, prisons, and even weapons in the hands of kings and popes. Their scandals did not stay hidden. They echoed through courts, cities, and entire nations. And as always, the women inside bore the brunt, their bodies, their reputations, their lives caught in the clash of power and faith. But these were not the last horrors. For when convent scandals turned inward, when the oppressions of cloistered life twisted into cruelty between the sisters themselves, the results could be even more chilling, because sometimes the enemy was not a priest, a pope, or a king, but another nun.